Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Alex DiVincenzo, or Vincenzo, depending which way you want to pronounce that last part of your last name, right, Alex?
That's right. It's the Italian in you brings out the Cenzo.
The Italian that I probably don't have in me, but it's fine. And today we're talking all about A Return to Salem's Lot, which is a 1987 movie that is the sequel to the classic 1979 miniseries, which, this is a movie. I didn't particularly like it much, to be honest with you, Alex.
No, I can't say that I was a big fan. Can I ask, have you ever seen another Larry Cohen movie before?
I'm not 100% sure. Let me just quickly browse here and see if anything sticks out to me.
Because he's a super prolific writer, director, producer in like the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
The Stuff is probably one of the Stuff and It's Alive are like two of his biggest ones.
I've definitely heard of some of his movies just looking at the list here, but I don't know if I've seen anything. I might have seen Cellular in 2004, but
Okay, yeah, because then he had a good career as a writer after
yeah.
much of his directing. He wrote Cellular, he wrote Phone Booth, Captivity. I asked because he usually has like a very distinct vision, but it kind of all seems lost in this. It's very atypical from him, so I wouldn't hold this one against him. It's like he just kind of got lost in this generic vampire story.
One of the things I noticed right off the bat was how hard this was to find because, it had a very limited theatrical release, if I'm not mistaken, but then it's one of those movies that got released by like the Warner Brothers archives or something, and it's pretty much a burn to disc deal. So it's like they don't even just have copies of this laying around. It's like you have to order it and then they will burn it for you and then send it. And the copy I managed to find, the quality was pretty bad on it. Like it was definitely standard definition, had never been redone or anything like that. And it was just so tough to watch. I was like, okay, just looking at this kind of gives me a headache. And, I know that the 1979 miniseries isn't the most fantastic thing in the world, but it was 1979, and you would think 8 years later they would at least have things looking better, but that wasn't really the case. And, you know, I think we can dive into the cast and characters a bit here because I wasn't really sure if there were any likable characters in this by the end of it. And most of the characters just didn't have much to do with anything. And if I'm not mistaken, none of them were from the actual story. Like none of the people seemed familiar to me based on just reading the book and watching the first miniseries. I was like, but where are all these people?
No, it's very far removed from both the book and the movie, I think.
Yeah, so it really felt like they just wanted to put new people in the town, and the town was really supposed to be the main character, but I still didn't get that sense either. I was like, okay, they clearly didn't use the same sets or anything like that because you do get this moment in an antique store and it kind of takes you back to the miniseries and the antique store that they have in there. But I was just like, yeah, I'm not really getting the same vibe here. It's just sort of this weird town. And I think what they wanted to try and do with these characters was really show the aftermath of everything that happened in the original Salem's Lot, either the book or the miniseries, whichever you prefer. And it just didn't quite capture the same essence of the town that I think the original did.
Yeah, I mean, not at all. Stephen King's so good at writing these kind of small town, folksy settings that feel like a character in and of themselves. And this one totally lacks that. Not to mention, at the end of the original, everything kind of burns down, and there's no remnants or mention of that at all in this.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, hey, the town's still here.
Yeah.
So it was definitely one of those things where it's hard to tell if Stephen King was really behind this one. He'll definitely express his opinions on even recent remakes and adaptations and everything like that. He's very vocal on Twitter, not just in a political sense, but also with, his own work and stuff like that. So with this happening so long ago, social media was not a thing. And unless he was interviewed about it and I just didn't catch it anywhere, I have no idea if he even really approved of this. And he's been outspoken before about things that use the Stephen King name, but don't really focus on his stories at all. Like there was an adaptation of The Lawnmower Man that had nothing to do with the Lawnmower Man story, and he like sued the people to get his name off of the movie.
Right, right. Now, yeah, I'm sure he wasn't involved in this one. It was definitely a kind of a cash grab from the Warner Brothers, I think. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was ever advertised as, Stephen King's Return to Salem's Lot, or even like based on Stephen King novel.
It did say that it was based on Stephen King characters and
Oh,
the
characters
story
created
at the
by.
beginning, I think,
That
but
makes
then
sense.
it was kind of like, okay, I guess, because, as far as I am aware, Stephen King created the town of Salem's Lot. It's not like it's a real town like
Right.
Boston that anyone could use in a story. He created this very specific town with this very specific story, and they definitely pulled from that. So he did get his name in the movie, and I think probably for legal reasons, they had to put that
Right.
here like, hey, we're basing this off of Stephen King's stuff, but he didn't have any real input in the movie, it seemed.
Yeah, I'm sure he just cashed just a paycheck, a very small paycheck, probably in the case of this movie.
Yeah. When you went to watch this, were you familiar with any of the actors in it though?
Yes.
Okay.
Michael Moriarty, who's the main guy, who's not so subtly named Hooper. I mean, he's probably best known for being on Law and Order for a few seasons in like the '90s, but he's like Larry Cohen's muse. He's been in a ton of his movies, so I instantly recognize him. Like that was fun to see him kind of do his thing. He's at times kind of like the only bright spot in the movie. Other times he's sort of just as bad as everyone else, depending on the scene.
Yeah, I think it's his quote unquote aunt who actually goes by the name Hooper, the last name.
Oh, is that what?
And
Okay,
yeah, so he goes by Weber and his son is
right, right.
Jeremy Weber, but Hooper is definitely, mentioned in here. And I think for me, other than Michael Moriarty, it was Tara Reid, whose name I was familiar with, but she was so young that I was like, oh, okay. And I haven't really seen anything that she's been in, but I know she's known for like the American Pie movies.
Yeah, yeah. And this was her first movie, I believe.
Yeah. And I mean, you can't really fault her for that, but not a great one.
No. Also, Michael Moriarty's character's ex-wife is played by Ronnie Blakely, who was the mom in A Nightmare on Elm Street.
Okay. Yeah. I did remember seeing that. I think sometimes with especially older movies, things will blend together for me. I'm like, wait, which one have I seen? Especially with the franchises like Halloween, A Nightmare on Elm Street,
Oh yeah,
Friday the
yeah.
13th. I'm like, which did I see? I just know we were watching like one of these, but I never paid attention to which one.
It happens.
Yeah. And other than that, it's like there are, I think, enough familiar names in this for the time to get people to go see it. But, I have not been able to really find any real solid box office numbers on this. And I think that's probably because it was such a limited release that it didn't make as much as Warner Brothers was hoping, I imagine.
Yeah, I think they probably knew what they were doing and kind of just put it out in theaters to see if they could cash in on the name, but it was probably predominantly produced for the direct-to-video market, which was kind of booming at the time.
And honestly, they still put things out direct to video, so it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's what
Yeah,
they did. But
not much
yeah,
has changed.
Box Office Mojo doesn't even have any numbers on it. So it's like, all right, if it's not there and it's not on Wikipedia and it's not in the Creep Shows book that I have that goes over a bunch of the movies and TV shows, then we probably won't find out what those numbers are unless we dig through like old magazines with interviews or something like that.
Yeah.
But were there any characters that really stood out to you in this? For me, it was sort of just like, okay, they're clearly playing on the fact that, Joe grew up here once upon a time, but you never really get that feeling that he kind of knows how the town works and everything if he grew up there.
Yeah, it's weird. He's definitely introduced as kind of this cold-hearted guy. So it's weird that he's your lead. And the same with his son. He's like kind of a sarcastic. They're both kind of sarcastic assholes, but I kind of like them for that. They have like a fun little back and forth sometimes. And the kid who plays Jeremy is like kind of hilarious sometimes. So I grew to like him. I don't know how much I cared about their fates, but I kind of liked them. I had some sympathy for them. But the character who stood out the most to me was, I mean, there's this bizarre kind of Nazi subplot where
Yeah.
the this anthropologist who says that I'm not a Nazi hunter, I'm a Nazi killer, which I love. He stood out to me, and he was played by Samuel Fuller,
Yeah.
who was like a filmmaker in the 40s, 50s, 60s,
Okay.
and then I guess became an actor later in his days with mixed results, if this is any indication. But I got a kick out of seeing him on screen.
Yeah, I would say his character was the most interesting as far as the plot goes because you're like, wait, this guy is acting like he's lost, like he's this old senile man. And then
Yeah.
it's like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. And it kind of just spices up the story a little bit, but not enough for me to really enjoy it. So it was just one of those things where you have these little glimpses of sort of what this movie could have been, especially if it had more of a budget behind it. Because, like in the miniseries, when you see the main vampire for the first time and he's like blue and got the big teeth and everything. They try to recreate that in this one. And story wise, it just didn't really work because the story didn't really revolve around that character. It revolved more around the other people. And I was just like, I think they're doing this just to sort of call back to the miniseries, but it looked so bad and so out of place. I was like, wait, what does this have to do with anything? Are they going to say, that same that same vampire is still alive? And I never really got that feeling because then the Nazi subplot took over.
Right, no, that's a good point. I don't think they ever mention Barlow. It's just like kind of, oh, here's another vampire doing a similar thing in the same town. I don't know. It's a weird approach to take. But yeah, he definitely kind of looks like a big rubber Halloween decoration. Like a cool Halloween decoration, but a bad movie prop.
Right. And like I said, the first miniseries didn't look too fantastic, but Barlow has sort of become iconic from that movie. It's sort of
Yeah.
like the Goblin truck in Maximum Overdrive. If you don't remember anything else from that movie, you will definitely remember the Goblin truck.
Yes,
And
exactly.
it's one of those things where, yes, some of this Stephen King stuff from the 70s and 80s might not be great, but some of them have still become iconic visually because of what they did, even if it wasn't necessarily good content otherwise. Maximum Overdrive is another one of those movies that wasn't great. And, it was a little better than this. I had a little more fun with it than I did with this, but it really seemed like this was something that was made for TV, but maybe didn't really get premiered on TV and instead went direct to video, or I don't know what exactly the deal was, but I was very confused to say the least.
Well, that's the thing in bringing up Maximum Overdrive. I mean, that, like you said, it's objectively not a particularly good movie, but it's like so crazy, it's fun. And a lot of Larry Cohen's work has that kind of aspect where it's like, it knows it's a B movie, but it also kind of has fun with it. Whereas this one just kind of, I'd rather a bad movie because it's at least entertaining, but this is just so like middle of the road, so like blasé. It's hard to get excited about anything going on.
Yeah, I really struggled to make it through just the story for this. I was like, okay, this guy had this entire life and he just gives it up because his ex-wife can't deal with their kid, and then it's like, okay. I mean, that's a lot to just sort of do, especially as weird as the opening was for this. And, it's only weird in the sense that they show us what Joe's work is, but then they never really return to that. It's just like, oh, yeah, he's away. And so we're going to give you this scene and not explain really anything about him other than his ex-wife can't deal with his kid, who didn't seem, like the best kid in the world, but he didn't seem like the worst kid in the world either. So I was like, okay, you guys can't handle this.
Yeah, I guess he's some kind of like documentarian, but then the vampires, I mean, spoiler alert, I guess, but they kind of like get him to write their story, I guess is their main objective other than turning everybody into vampires? I don't know. It was confusing. I'm not sure why
Yeah.
exactly.
I think they wanted to bring the writer portion in to
Yeah,
again call back to the original because, the main character there is a writer coming to write about the town. And so they just find this random dude and like get him to come back to Salem's Lot. And he's not even an actual writer because being a documentarian and being a writer are two completely different things as far as,
right.
writing a book and that goes. If he was maybe writing a script, that would make more sense. But yeah, writing their like Bible, so to speak, I was just like, what is going on? This movie, the plot was all over the place. And the fact that this Nazi subplot ends up being the most interesting thing about a movie about vampires is also very weird.
I do think, speaking of the plot being all over the place, how fickle the main character is, because I mean, he learns that the town's full of vampires like pretty early on, and that his aunt, who he thought was dead, is also one of them, and he just kind of like accepts it. He's like, "Yeah, all right, you're all vampires. I'll write your story. Why not?" And then like he has like a 2 minute conversation with one of the townspeople who's like a half vampire, I guess.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden he's like, "No, no, give me my son back." Like he's just, I don't know, he's just goes with the flow, I guess.
And then he clearly still has this attachment to this girl he liked when he was a kid, and she gets pregnant, and it's just so much at once. And you're like, wait, can we just slow down and focus on one of these things? And the movie never really does that.
No, no, it just kind of spins its tires in all these different areas. But yeah, if it did focus on one, like there's some interesting threads in there, or at least things that could be interesting if they were explored more. But everything's
Yeah.
just kind of tossed at the wall to see what sticks, and because of that, nothing really does.
It's like they spun all of the threads with no intention of finishing any of them off.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, the story was really just too all over the place for me. And even reading the book, I really, really felt like I got a grasp of what the town was all about because you would have the chapters where you would spend time just with, the town and the townspeople and getting to know people outside of the main characters in their story. And with this, it's like they try to do that. They show you different parts of the town, like the school and everything. But then you're like, okay, so the kids go to school. That's kind of normal. And you're making it weird. And I just didn't really know what was happening like half the time with this movie.
Yeah, there's a lot of meandering around.
That's definitely a good way to put it. So it sounds like we're definitely on the same page with this movie. So, this might be a relatively short episode, just given the fact that it's like an hour and 40 minutes, and it probably didn't even need to be that long, to be honest with
No.
you. But my main question about the story is, does this even work for you as a sequel to the 1979 miniseries?
Not really. It almost feels more like a really, really low budget remake than a sequel, which I guess is kind of par for the course for a lot of like bad direct to video horror sequels.
Yeah.
But it just kind of takes like, the main plot elements and recycles them with all new characters, which to me is such like a cop out for any sequel. I understand like it was many years later, and I get not getting the same actors and stuff, but at least give us Barlow, give us something to make us care again. Because if you've already invested the 3 hours or whatever in the miniseries, and then you're coming to like, oh, you return to Salem's Lot, I don't know, just felt cheap in that regard.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot going on. And it was just like, okay, you didn't really go all in on one thing. And I felt like if they would have gone all in on continuing at least one aspect from the original miniseries, even if they had a cheap budget, they could have made the story work.
Yeah, I mean it doesn't cost you any money to write a good script, but they struggled with that.
Clearly, someone should have called Stephen King.
I did read though that Larry Cohen wrote an early draft for the original, the Toby Hooper version of Salem's Lot, before when it was meant to be a theatrical film.
Okay.
And I guess he fought for screen credit, so he would, so he'd get residuals and the benefits that come with that, but lost. So I don't know if maybe they like just threw him this sequel down the line as kind of like a compensation. Sorry for what happened,
Right.
but I don't know. I don't know if it was budgetary restraints. I'm sure there was a lot of studio input just because it was a name property. And he Cohen wrote the script with James Dixon, who appeared in a lot of Cohen's earlier movies as an actor. He's in all three It's Alive movies. But I don't think he had much of a writing career, which isn't too shocking after seeing this. So I don't know. It's just all over the place.
Yeah, it really just didn't work for me as a whole, even as a sequel. I was like, what exactly is this supposed to be about? Because none of it, other than the name of the town and vampires being there, really connects with the first story.
Right, exactly.
Well, like I said, I know this probably isn't going to be super long, but is there anything else about the story specifically that you want to talk about?
I want to mention that there is an amazingly cheesy fight in a river that was probably one of the highlights of the movie for me.
Yeah. Yeah, he just has a few guys coming after him from different directions. And, he's a pretty apt fighter considering we don't really know much about him. He sort of just seems, to know just enough to get by. And even when they're in like the church, I think it is later, or the town hall, whichever it is, and there's a ton of people in there with him, or vampires, and he just starts punching them left and right, and he's clearly vastly outnumbered and yet still manages to thwart all of them.
I guess it's his documentarian background. I don't know.
Yeah, it is something that I definitely noticed it because I was like, wait, does he have any sort of like training just because of like the areas he's been to as a documentarian or what? Because as you and I both know, documentarians can go to some pretty dangerous places to get a story. So I kind of just chalked it up to us not knowing a lot about Joe, other than the fact that, he would come stay with his Aunt Clara every now and that he spent a few years in Salem's Lot. And I don't know, I feel like it was still hard to believe that he really had this sort of intense connection with the town.
Yeah, it was hard to believe anything in this movie had an intense connection with anything else in the movie.
Very, very true. So I guess before we wrap up with some final thoughts here, what would you end up rating this movie?
I'd say, wait, what's your rating scale? What are we rating out of?
Out of 5, let's say.
Out of five? Okay, I'd say probably a two.
Okay. See, I was a little meaner. I gave it like half a star because I was just
Oh,
so bored
ouch.
with it the entire time.
No, I mean that's perfectly reasonable. Like I said, I mean I tried to make fun with it for better or for worse. There's like a couple good special effects that were all. I mean, you can tell they're all second unit because they're all like in close up, and then when I cut back to the wide, there's no more blood.
Yeah.
But I appreciated they got a little buddy with it because I couldn't for the first one because it was for TV.
Yeah.
But yeah, just misses the mark. But I will say, I know I opened with the same sentiment, but don't hold this against Larry Cohen. You should seek out some of his work because it's just like it's like fiercely weird and original, and usually has some kind of like socio-political subtext to it. All of which is lacking from this. So yeah, seek out other Larry Cohen films before
Okay.
Return to Salem's Lot.
Yeah, especially if you're listening to this and you have not seen this. I would definitely say that if you are listening to this and you haven't seen A Return to Salem's Lot, you don't really need to.
Yeah,
If you
we
want.
just summarized the entire plot in 10 minutes, and it was probably slightly more entertaining than the movie. I hope.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot more fun talking about these bad adaptations or, just sort of attempts at continuing Stephen King stories that don't have Stephen King involved than I do actually consuming them. So
Yes.
it's one of those things where, I try not to just sort of hate on things that I don't like, but we did point out that there were things that could have made this movie much better. And because the details on what really happened with this movie are pretty scarce, like we don't know if they did this on $100,000 budget or what, but some of the movies, especially in the 70s and 80s, were working with, less than $500,000 budgets. So it wouldn't surprise me if this didn't have a very big budget. And that is sort of why it ended up being the way it did. Maybe they had script rewrites, which those still happen today. Those can definitely ruin a movie.
Yeah, yeah. I wish there was more information about it. There's actually a great documentary about Larry Cohen, King Cohen, that came out like a year or two ago. Um, and they go through almost every one of his movies, like movie by movie, and they just completely gloss over Return to Salem's Lot. Like there's no information even in the movie about it. I think they talk about Samuel Fuller a little bit just because it was like fun to work with him, but it's like
Hmm.
no behind the scenes details really, which was kind of disappointing because like yeah, I love hearing about the good movies, but I want to hear about like what went wrong on the bad movies.
Yeah, yeah. And I was kind of bummed that the Creep Shows book didn't have too terribly much more to add to that. They only have like a 2-page entry for this movie. So, it's kind of the bigger movies like Pet Cemetery comes after this,
Right, right.
or The Running Man does. But either way, those sort of have bigger names, bigger budgets, and you can definitely tell that those movies, even though they might not stand up super, super well in 2019, they definitely have a higher quality to them. But I think that sort of just wraps up this conversation. Like I said, a pretty short episode here. But Alex, before you go, since this is your first appearance on the podcast, is there anything you do that you would like to plug real quick?
Oh, I would love to. I run a horror film website called brokehorrorfan.com. Predominantly highlights like horror merchandise, everything from shirts, posters, toys, collectibles, anything under the sun that has to do with a horror movie. I like to shine a little spotlight on that. You can find that at brokehorrorfan.com. We also recently started a line of horror films on VHS. We're putting out modern horror movies in the retro format. We have a few titles available. We have a pretty big slate coming up throughout the rest of the year that we're really excited about. Other than that, you can follow Broke Horror Fan on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can follow me. I'm at Alex's Legend on Twitter. I'm signed up for a few more movies, Stephen King adaptations, so you'll be hearing from me again in the future.
Yes, definitely go check out Broke Horror Fan. I always check out the site and I always try very hard not to spend money.
Well, thank you for checking it out. I appreciate that. But yeah, we get a lot of like happy, angry tweets. Sometimes we'll be like, "Oh, you made me buy this, but now I'm happy." So I don't know, but it's a fun service to provide.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure a lot of people appreciate it. But Alex, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. I don't know if, what comes next is something that I will enjoy more than this. Hopefully it is. But, for a lot of these movies, I'm watching them for the first time, especially the ones that are clearly harder to find like this one. So it's been quite the experience. And even though some like this art is great, it's definitely still fun talking about them.
Yeah, like you said, it was more fun to talk about it than it was to actually watch it. So I would suggest not returning to Salem's Lot.
Exactly. Maybe not until, like 2004 when the remake comes out. We'll see.
To be continued.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, you can follow the podcast at Chat Cemetery on Twitter and Instagram. I have a Patreon that I will link to if you guys want to support this podcast and my other podcast, Welcome to Geekdom. It'll allow me to bring you some bonus content, with this one. Maybe I'll read some of Stephen King's nonfiction work and do bonus episodes on that. It'll all just depend. But if you want to support, check out the Patreon link. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.